So we're going to be in the book of 2 Kings, and in our last class we were able to finish up the previous section. We got through chapter 7. So today we're going to start into 2 Kings chapter 8. 2 Kings chapter 8. And I actually just changed a day or two ago what I was going to call this particular chapter. I had a particular thought in mind, and nothing necessarily wrong with the thought that I had, but as I kept going back through the chapter and thinking through it, I thought, I need to make sure I can at least pull that thought out about God's sovereignty. That's something I think that maybe it really shines through this chapter, but if we don't have it in mind, we might not necessarily see that as we go through. I want to try as best as we can as we kind of work through it to make sure that we can pull the thoughts out about how it is we see God's sovereignty. That is, God's power, His authority, how it is that He is fully in control of the situation and fully in control of the people, whether they are good or whether they are evil. But as we get into this chapter and we think about God's sovereignty, and of course we're going to get into some of these evil kings, it actually begins in a pretty good spot. And it begins with someone who is faithful that we've seen before, and we're going to see how the Lord is going to provide in the first 6 verses of this particular chapter. But let's start out by looking at verses 1 and 2. If somebody could, would you read 2 Kings chapter 8, verses 1 and 2?
Then Elisha spoke to the woman whose son he had restored to life, saying, "Arise and go, you and your household, and stay wherever you can. For the Lord has called for a famine, and furthermore, it will come upon the land for 7 years." So the woman arose and did according to the saying of the man of God. And she went with her household and dwelt in the land of the Philistines 7 years.
And so we see this particular warning that's given. Who is the warning being given to? To the Shunammite woman, right? The woman whose son had been restored to life. And we know that is the Shunammite woman based on what we looked at in 2 Kings chapter 4. And so we know there's already a relationship there between Elisha and the Shunammite woman and her family with everything that had gone on between them. And we see Elisha giving this warning to the woman. What is his warning, and what is he telling her to do? There's about to be a famine in the land for how long? For 7 years. So what is Elisha telling the woman to do with her family? Go where there's food, right? Go where the famine's not going to affect you and your family. And so they're going to go and move to the land of the Philistines. If you look at the map, it's hard to see, I know, because of zooming it out so we can get everything on there. But basically, this is Shunem up here, where the woman and her family lived. This is Samaria, just kind of that marker where you have the capital of Israel. But it's down in this area where you have the land of the Philistines. So Elisha's warning is telling her to go from her home up here with her family to, pack what they can, and then travel on down and live in the land of the Philistines for these 7 years. So that's what it is that's going on in this particular situation. And the warning is asking them to go and to get to the land of the Philistines. Now, it's interesting as we look at this, because it's about to kind of be brought out here in just a second, that we don't know exactly what the time frame of all of these things is. It's not, I mentioned it before, and I'm sure I'll mention it again as we go through the study, that when you look at Hebrew history, it's not like our history. Whenever we're studying history, we're going to start, say, American history. We might start, going back into when the Pilgrims first came over, so you're in the 1600s, right? And we'll start there and work our way up to the year 2025, just kind of going 1 year at a time. That's not exactly how Hebrew history works. Hebrew history is much more focused on a particular idea or a particular theme. And so sometimes it might bounce back and forth between years. And so that seems like what's going on right now, but it's getting us ahead to where we need to be. And I think the reason it's coming out in this particular way is because of that thought of God's sovereignty, to show He's in control over the faithful as well as those who are not so faithful. He's taking care of those who are truly His. And that's where we have this thought that the Lord provides. But if we think about this particular warning that's being given. I think that there's maybe a lesson in this for us, especially knowing who the Shunammite woman is and knowing of her faith. So what type of a lesson do you think we can learn from the warning that Elisha is giving about this famine?
She listened.
All right, she listened.
She listened and did what he told her to do.
So even when it might be something that's hard for us to, fathom, you think about moving your entire family into this land of foreign people, that's going to be a hard thing to do, right? But she listened and she followed, and that's because of that faith that she had. And so there's a good lesson right there that we can learn to think about whenever it is, even if it's hard, if we have faith, we need to follow and obey. So that's a good thought there. What else might we think about? Think about it from this perspective, and this is kind of where my mind was going with it. Do we face difficulty and hardship in life?
Yes.
Of course we do. It doesn't matter if we're faithful or if we are unfaithful, we're still going to face hardship and difficulty, right? But sometimes it might be because we are faithful that maybe, just maybe, we're spared from the full difficulty that we could face. It's not always going to be the case. But why is it that this woman is receiving this warning?
She's shown favor to us.
She's shown faith, right? She's shown favor to God's people. She's shown favor to Elisha. She has taken care of him and shown great hospitality and shown and proven that she is one who's concerned with doing right by God. Maybe, just maybe, this is God's way of being able to help spare her from what's to come. Now, she still has a choice to make. She still has a decision to make in it. Back to Velda's point, that she hears it and she actually follows through with it. And so sometimes for us, maybe we don't know what we might be spared when it is that we live in faith. But I want to bring out again the fact that we are all going to face hardship and difficulty. But sometimes the degree to which we face it might just be different depending on whether or not we're living as God would have us to. Not going to excuse us or make us be exempt from the hardship that comes. But maybe, just maybe, we don't get it to the degree that we would if we were to just ignore the warning and stay in the land for 7 years of famine. Because you remember how bad the famine got? If you go back towards the end of 2 Kings chapter 6, remember how bad it got? They get to the point that they're ready to boil and eat their own children. This woman is spared from it because she's faithful to God. Just a thought that I had thinking about this. Johnny?
I was going to say, whenever God gives us a warning, it's for our own good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. The warning, like you say, is for our own good. It's not always easy. It's not always comfortable to hear, especially when it is that it's something that is, for her in this situation, the warning is famine is coming. You need to get your family moved to the land of the Philistines. Sometimes the warning from the prophets is a much more direct, of basically pointing out all of the things that you've been doing wrong, and if you don't change it, if you don't repent, this is what's going to come upon you. That's a very difficult warning to hear, but a warning nonetheless, and to your point, it's for our good. So what are we going to do whenever we hear those warnings, whenever we find those warnings for our own lives through the Scriptures? But that's the warning that we see in these first two verses of the chapter. But as we continue, then we're going to fast forward 7 years and see the return. We don't see anything that takes place in the land of the Philistines, but then we just go from verse 2 to now 7 years later in verse 3. And so again, this just shows some of that, of how the history can kind of jump around a little bit, that it's not exactly chronological, because there's a lot that took place within those 7 years. But somebody read for us now verses 3 through 5.
It came to pass at the end of 7 years that the woman returned from the land of the Philistines, and she went to make an appeal to the king for her house and for her land. Then the king talked with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, "Tell me, please, all the great things Elisha has done." Now it happened, as he was telling the king how he had restored the dead to life, that there was the woman whose son he had restored to life. appealing to the king for her house and for her land. And Gehazi said, My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son, whom Elisha restored to life.
So whenever we look at these verses, we find after the 7 years that the Shunammite woman returns, and then it tells us, where does she go? She goes to make an appeal before the king of Israel. We don't know exactly what king this would have been. Some of the things I was looking at suggested, well, maybe this is Jehoram, maybe it was Jehu. We don't really know with certainty. The best we can figure looking at it is trying to think through, well, what all have we seen happen during this time? You could go back to the end of 2 Kings chapter 4 after everything with the Shunammite woman, and we see the famine in the land at that point. And we know that Gehazi is still in the picture based on what we see right here. But what did we learn about Gehazi based on the end of chapter 5? He got leprosy and was no longer in service to Elisha. So it's something that's happening between all of that time frame. But who the specific king is really doesn't make any difference to what's being emphasized through this particular history right now. But we know that the woman is going to the king to make the appeal for the land. Based on the fact that this is her, because it specifies the woman returned from the land, and she went to make an appeal to the king for her house, for her land. What's that probably tell us then about her husband? He's most likely passed away. Now, going back to 2 Kings chapter 4, we already recognize the fact that he was advanced in years. That's what the text tells us there. So, during the course of all this time, her husband has very likely passed away. Now she's having to take care of things herself. Because it's her that's still going and doing these things, chances are that her son that they were blessed with, that was restored to life based on verse 1, based on what we saw in chapter 4, the son was probably still quite a bit younger. He wouldn't have been, taking care of the family business or the matters of the family at that time. So he got older, he probably would have been the one to do it. So we're still talking, the child is maybe, a young teenager at this point. Probably that'd be the oldest that he would be right now. And so we see kind of what's going on, and here she is stepping up, doing the difficult thing to go and to try to do what's best for her family. Think about the courage that it would have taken for her after 7 years being gone, to go and to stand before the king to request all of their land back. Now, the custom at the time was, whenever it was there was a situation such as this, and whenever a home and someone's land had been kind of deserted in this fashion, what happened was that land went into possession of the king. And then if anyone from the family were to ever come back and make a request for the land, there'd be the process they'd go through to determine, okay, yes, that actually is your family's. Here it comes back to you. But there's some amazing things that happen that were not typical for the day in this particular situation. And I think that's because what we find is maybe, just maybe, we see God's providence at work right here through this section as the Lord provides for this woman and her family. How might we see God's providence in this particular section?
I just happened to be there at the same time when he's talking about it. There she is.
That perfect timing, right? Just so happened that when the woman is coming to make the appeal for her land, for her home again, what's Gehazi talking to the king about? And what is the king interested in? They're talking about the prophet Elisha, and the king wants to know, well, tell me more about this prophet, and tell me more about what all that he has done. That's interesting right there, because has any king of Israel to this point shown any interest in the things of God? Not at all. Matter of fact, we've seen multiple times now where the king actually wants to kill Elisha. But here, he's kind of interested to see, well, tell me more about this man. Tell me some war stories. I want to hear about it. I want to, what was it like? What did it sound like? What was going on? And that's what's happening. And now Gehazi starts telling the king about, you'll never believe what happened in Shunem. There's this lady who showed kindness to myself, to Elisha, time and time again, and Elisha promised her that she would have a son. And so she has this son, even though it was pretty clear to her and her husband that they weren't going to be able to have children. God blesses them with this son that Elisha promised, and then a few years later, here the woman shows up, and the son has died. And you'll never believe what Elisha did next. We went to the house. I tried to raise the son. I couldn't raise him, but I can promise you that boy was dead. And then Elisha went in after me, and somehow Elisha, by the power of God, is able to raise this boy back from the dead. And then can you see as they kind of look out the window, or they look out who's coming towards the king's palace there? And Gehazi says, and now you'll never believe it was that woman. And there's her son right there. How is that timing able to come about that perfectly? It's God.
The old saying, hindsight's 20/20, is true, and it's a good thing. But in many ways, when we read through the Old Testament, we see from front to end the providential care of God. But we don't have to go back to the Old Testament to find that, because every one of us, we can't see it always at the time it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
But when we look over our lives, especially the older we get, we see God's providence. You know, I look back through my life, and God, through His providential care, my path would cross with somebody that I really needed at that time to prepare me for something later in life. And those things would have happened over and over. And, you know, a guy that's at the end of his rope, about ready to give up, and comes across a Facebook say of the home of recovery. You come in contact with a person that leads to this opportunity of work, this opportunity of service in the kingdom. And each time, what we should do, though, is each time that happens, as we see it in the hindsight, it should build our faith. It should give me more confidence that, you know, I don't know what the next problem or crisis I'm going to face in life, but I look back and I see, but God has taken me through it every time. Mm-hmm. And every one of us can say that. And so we should have less anxiety, less fear, and more faith, because we can all see God's amazing providential care and love in our lives.
Mm-hmm. I can't help but think for this woman, as she's coming before the king, that, you know, in her mind she's thinking about all that God had done for her. And I'm sure, I mean, her being human, there's going to be an element of, I don't know how God's going to do this, but I know that He will. Right? If He could do this for me back then, if He could raise my son from the dead, then I know that He can do this and restore these belongings to myself and to my family to take care of us. To your point, we think about our own lives and what God has done for us, and know, while we haven't had the miraculous like she had experienced, we've seen and experienced God's providence in our life. But are we able to actually look back and recognize that perhaps, maybe, just maybe, right, using the language of the Bible, we can't say for certain, but we're pretty certain that this is the hand of God, that this is His providence, that He's the one bringing it to pass. And we know He's taken care of us through that. We didn't see how it was going to happen, but He provided for us there, that when it seemed like we had nothing and there was no way we were going to make it, God provided for us again. So whatever situation we find ourselves in now, if we can remember all of that, then we ought to be able to say, I don't know how He'll do it, but He'll do it. And that's the type of faith that we ought to have. That's the way that we can trust in God, thinking back and seeing His providence in our lives, but also in the lives of His people throughout the Scriptures.
In the moment, we trust in God's promise. In hindsight, we see God's promise.
Mm-hmm. And then when we see it, what do we do about it? Do we just see it and say, wow, that's pretty neat? Or instead, do we recognize God's providence in our life and praise Him for it and thank Him for it? And that's the attitude that we ought to have through it all. And so we can certainly see God's providence then as this woman returns. And, I just wonder how it all went, because we know based on verses 3 and 4 what it is that Gehazi was telling the king, and then based on the end of verse 5, we see how it is, or even, I guess actually when we get into verse 6, that's where it is. When we see this blessing unfold, we'll see at the first part of verse 6 how it is that the king asks the woman, tell me about this. Does it all add up? It was unbelievable when he told me, but can you confirm that that's actually what happened? And then, of course, there's going to be this great blessing that follows. Somebody, if you would, read 2 Kings chapter 8 and verse 6.
And when the king asked the woman, she told him. So the king appointed a certain officer for her, saying, restore all that was hers, and all the proceeds of the field from the day that she left the land until now.
So the typical custom would have been, okay, we can recognize and we can see through the records, yes, this was your family's, here is your land restored to you. But what is the special blessing that this woman receives on top of that? Yeah, it's not just their home and their land, but it's all the proceeds that they would have made for how long? For the 7 years that they had been gone. That's the blessing right there. That is the power, and again, the working and the providence of God. Because now it's not just, okay, now we have a place that we can stay and we can just kind of start over. But, we probably exhausted all of our resources to get to the land of the Philistines and then to get from there back to here. Now what do we have? 7 years worth of wages, 7 years worth of the goods that would have been this family's, that's now being restored back to them for a family who, remember, husband very likely has died, and the son is not yet old enough to be taking care of the family business, so he's really not old enough yet to be working to provide entirely for the family. So you see God providing for them, not just that they have the place to stay and the land to work, but they're taken care of now. They're set. That's the power and the providence of God. Did I see your hand, Paul?
I would say, King James says, fruits of the field, proceeds, the harvest, 7 years worth of harvest.
Mm-hmm.
7 years worth of food. They could be obviously stored, so they don't have to we missed harvest this year, so what do we eat?
Mm-hmm.
What do we, how do we, we've got a home, we've got land, but maybe, whatever time of year it was, maybe it's pre-harvest, post-harvest, but, food and blessing and that for 7 years worth since she's been gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's just they don't have to worry about those things, and that's all because God's taking care of them through it. And again, like we mentioned earlier, I'm sure in her mind the thought is, I don't know how, but I know that He will. And that's a very difficult mindset for us to come to as well, to think about, I know what it is that needs to happen, but I don't know how God's going to do it. But do I trust that He will? That's a great challenge for us in faith, to be able to recognize that it's not anything I can do, that there's no way I can bring this to pass, and the only way that it can happen is God. Do we have that type of faith? Do we have that type of trust in Him?
Preston.
Yes, sir.
Maybe the case King saw, heard the story, confirmed the story, like, look, this woman had faith in the one true God. She's blessed with a son. The son dies. He's restored because of her continued faith that he stated. And, okay, give this woman back her land, 7 years worth of harvest, put everything back to where it was. And maybe trying to replicate the blessings that she had from God. But if you trust in God and obey God, you'll be blessed beyond measure. So his efforts to try to put things back the way they were, one way or another, whether it was him or for somebody else, you know, she continued to trust in God, and she was continually blessed. As we look at it, he looked at it almost from an outsider looking in, saying, well, I see what God has done for this woman. That must be the one true God. And every time she's continued to have faith, she's continually blessed.
Absolutely. And you know, that's a good lesson there, you know, to think about even for that king. And what he should have gained and learned from that is, I need to have faith like her. Maybe it was there for a little bit, but of course we know, going through the history of all these kings of Israel, that whatever elements of faith they were very short-lived among them. But the lesson should have been to him, to those who were there among the king, to the officer who restores these things to her, I need to be able to develop a faith like her, because I see what God has done for her in her life, and he'd be able to do the same for me in my life. So that's a good thought to bring out there. And one more thing on this before we go into the next section here. Something I want to pull out, and maybe you noticed it as we went through. There's a particular word, at least stands out to me, and I don't remember what it is in some of the other translations, but at least in the New King James Version, there's a particular word through these 6 verses that just kind of stands out and is repeated quite a few times. Anybody happen to notice what word that is?
Restored.
Restored. Look at verse 1. Verse 1, you see Elisha spoke to the woman whose son he restored to life. And then once you get down to verse 5, that's where it really stands out. Verse 5, it happened as he was telling the king how he had restored the dead to life, that there was the woman whose son he had restored to life. You keep going down, you get to the end of the verse. My Lord, O king, this is the woman and this is her son whom Elisha restored to life. You get into verse 6, and what's the king tell the officer to do? Restore all that was hers. You think there's anything in particular that we can gain from that repeated word? What is God able to do? He's able to restore. And certainly we see that here for this woman in the very physical sense, but we can think about that from the spiritual sense as well, that God truly is the restorer. And so that's another thing we can take from that, and how we can see even his sovereignty, the control, the power that he has as he provides for this woman and her family. So let's move on then into this next part, and this is where we'll start to get into some of these evil kings in the chapter. But even through these evil kings, we're still going to see God's sovereignty, again, his power, his reign, his authority, all of these things shining through. So as we look at Hazael's takeover, we'll have somebody read, if you would, verses 7 through 9. 2 Kings chapter 8, verses 7 through 9.
Then Elijah went to Damascus, and Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, was sick. And it was told him, saying, the man of God has come here. And the king said to Hazael, take a present in your hand, and go to meet the man of God, and inquire of the Lord by him, saying, shall I recover from this disease? So Hazael went to meet him, and took a present with him of every good thing of Damascus, 40 camel loads. And he came and stood before him and said, your son Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, has sent me to you, saying, shall I recover from this disease?
So we find Elisha in Damascus. I don't know exactly why Elisha's heading to Damascus, because that is obviously not Israel, right? That's a foreign people, a pagan people. They're not concerned with God. Now, the most likely reason why it is that he's going there, and I guess I say I don't know why I'm talking, I don't know what I'm doing. He was going there for a specific reason. I was getting ahead of myself in my head. If you go back to 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 19, it seems like the reason he's going to Damascus is to finish up what Elijah was told that Elijah himself needed to do back in 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 19, read with me in verse 15. It says, the Lord said to him, this is again to Elijah, Go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Also you shall anoint Jehu the son of Nimshi as king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place. It shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill, and whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill. And so this is back in 1 Kings 19, and this is Elijah being specifically told to go where? Go to the wilderness of Damascus, and specifically you anoint who is king? Hazael. And then you're going to go, and you're going to take Elisha, anoint him as prophet in your place, and also in Israel you're going to anoint who? Jehu as king over Israel. So these are the things that Elijah was supposed to do. But what's the only thing of that list right there that Elijah did? Anoint Elisha. Why Elijah doesn't do the others, I don't really know. Maybe that's something he was on his way to go do whenever the word comes that the Lord was going to take him. We don't know for certain. We do know, obviously, that he was blessed, that he was faithful to God to the end, and that's why it is that he is taken as he is. And so, whatever the reason Elijah doesn't end up getting to it, we see that Elisha does get to it. And that's what's happening here in 2 Kings chapter 8, getting to Hazael in Damascus. We're going to see that anointing take place here in just a moment. But it's interesting to me, and maybe it's just me, I don't know, but I think about the amount of time that has elapsed. And in my head, a lot of times I think, well, you get through 1 Kings and you get past Elijah, now we're into Elisha. And in my head, again, thinking about history the way that we go through history as Americans, very chronologically, I think in my head, like, we're probably like 30 years down the road from Elijah at this point. But really and truly, we're probably not that far from when Elijah was taken. Because we see all of these people who are still here who are now ready to take over as king. And we see God's sovereignty even in the fact that he's telling Elijah, go to Damascus and anoint this king over this foreign nation in Syria because he's going to do this for me. Well, now we see Elisha following through, and we see what it is that's going to take place as Hazael is going to be anointed as king. And that gets us then to Elisha's sad knowledge. Well, before that, here's a map for you. Forgot I had this one in there. But this is the map to Damascus. So you have Samaria down here. So this would have been kind of where Elisha was. Up to Damascus, where Hazael would have been at this time, and King Ben-Hadad, who's sick. That's about 100 miles or so, just straight shot there. But of course, they're not doing that as just a straight shot. There's going to be mountains and things they've got to go up and down to get there. So that's not an easy journey to be able to get to Damascus just for this purpose. One other thing I forgot to mention as I got ahead of myself and whatever else is going on in my head right now. When he gets to Syria, what's the situation with Ben-Hadad? He's sick. But Ben-Hadad hears that Elisha's coming, and so what does he do in response? Let's go get 40 of the biggest camels we have. Let's load them down to the brim with all of the finest things that Damascus and that Syria have to offer, and let's parade them out in front of Elisha, and then, Hazael, I need you to say to Elisha, am I going to get better? Am I going to be able to get out of this bed? Because when he sees all of these goods out there, and he knows we mean no harm, and I want to bless him and take care of him and make him a very, 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 very rich man, he's going to pray to his God and tell his God, you make this man get better. Now, that's the mindset of what it is that's going on for Ben-Hadad. That's why Hazael is going out to meet him with that question, shall I recover from this disease? But then that gets us to Elisha's sad knowledge. Somebody read now, if you would, 2 Kings chapter 8, verses 10 through 14.
And And Elisha said to him, Go say to him, you shall certainly recover. However, the Lord has shown me that he will really die. Then he set his countenance in a stare until he was ashamed. And the man of God wept. And Hazael said, Why is my Lord weeping? He answered, Because I know the evil that you will do to the children of Israel. Their strongholds you will set on fire. Their young men you will kill with the sword. And you will dash their children and rip open their women with child. So Hazael said, But what is your servant, a dog, that he should do this gross thing? And Elisha answered, The Lord has shown me that you will become king over Syria. Then he departed from Elisha and came to his master, who said to him, What did Elisha say to you? And he answered, He told me you would surely recover.
The way that this starts is one that can be a little bit of a challenge, and I don't know that I have the right answer for it, even myself. But when you look in verse 10 and you see what Elisha's doing, Elisha's telling Hazael, you go to Ben-Hadad and tell him you're going to get better, you're going to recover. But this is actually what's going to happen. Then he goes through and he tells him how the Lord has revealed to me all these terrible things, Hazael, that you're going to do because you're actually going to be the one to kill him, and then you'll become king. And of course, that's not anything comfortable for Elisha to do. Something that's a little bit, it doesn't necessarily show in the English, but kind of looking through some different translations, trying to get a better idea of what exactly is going on here. Essentially what it seems like is happening is after Elisha tells him in verse 10, you're going to go tell Ben-Hadad he'll recover, but the Lord has shown me that he's actually going to die. It's almost like there's just this moment of great silence, and Elisha's just staring at Hazael, making him extremely uncomfortable, to the point at which Hazael says, why are you weeping? Because at some point through this intense stare that's going on, Elisha just loses it. Because Elisha knows what's coming, and that's when he reveals what it is that's taking place. Now, the difficult thing, and if I have time, I'll get to you in a second, AG. The difficult thing here and the challenge is, what does it seem like Elisha is telling Hazael to go do? It really seems like he's telling Hazael to go lie to the king. Now, would a man of God actually be counseling someone to go lie? No. Anyone who's speaking the truth of God's word and carrying the message of God is not going to be encouraging someone to go into sin. So the best that I can tell of what this seems like is really taking place is that Elisha is not telling him to go do this, but it's more so Elisha telling him, this is what you are going to do. Now, Hazael kind of tries to hide it, and it's almost, you think about what happens whenever somebody calls you out, and somebody knows what it is you're thinking and what it is you plan to do, and it's not anything that's good for you to do, right? Your response is, you think I would do that? Are you serious? Hazael says, do you think I'm an animal? Do you think I'm a dog that I would do these terrible things? But you look at history and what happens. Hazael does all of those things. And it begins in verse 15 with Ben-Hadad's murder. You look at verse 15 and you see how it happened on the next day, after he had already told him you would recover, happened on the next day that he took a thick cloth and dipped it in water and spread it over his face so that he died, and Hazael reigned in his place. So Hazael did not have to go do those things, but what does he do? He starts heading down that path because it's what it is that he was wanting to do in the first place. And so that's why, again, in my mind, the way I'm understanding this is Elisha is not telling him to go do this, but instead it's more or less Elisha saying, well, you're going to go tell him this. And like I said, I don't know that that's the right answer. I don't know that that's the best answer, but in my mind, that's the way that I'm reasoning it and understanding it, to recognize these things, because what I do know is that no man of God is ever going to be encouraging someone and commanding someone to go and to sin. And so that's the way I'm understanding that right there. We only have like a minute left. I had some other things to mention there, but I want to try to get to this. This is a point that we can bring out some archaeological things. 3 things I want to try to show you quickly. May not be able to read everything that's up there, but basically this is a record that was found from an Assyrian king, Shalmaneser III. And within this, he actually mentions Hazael over Damascus, and he mentions Jehu, who we're going to see a little bit later being anointed king over Israel. And so that's a record that we have secular from a different country that names these specific people that we're reading about in the Bible. Here's another one here. This is a statue that was found of Shalmaneser III. On this statue, if you get close to it, you can see writing all around it. And within this particular statue, again, you see mention of Hazael, you see mention of Jehu. And actually, it's interesting on this particular statue about Hazael, it actually calls him the son of a nobody, because in that time, what that meant was that he was one who wasn't supposed to be in that position because he's not from a family that reigned, but instead, he's one that came from nobody to become king. And that's exactly what he does, is he murders Ben-Hadad so he can become king. And then the last one that I'll put up here right now, this is the Tel Dan Stela. This was one that scholars believe actually was commissioned by Hazael himself. And so this is something that was from Hazael. It talked about some of his battles, things like that they did. But the most significant thing about this particular discovery was that it actually was the first secular historical document that was found that mentions David by name. The time this was found, there were some who were beginning to believe, well, David was not actually real. He was just a made-up figure that was like a superhero for the Israelites during their time, and there is no historical record, they said, because they didn't believe the Bible to be history, of David. And then this is found, and it blows all of that out of the water and confirms, of course, the biblical account of things. So that's just another discovery found connected to, related to Hazael. But I always think those are important to bring up whenever we can. But that's all the time we got for this morning. So thank you all for y'all's attention.